First time I tried to draft my own custom bodice block was back in 2004. And to give you some context, that was before YouTube was founded, and that was before information on niche topics like drafting your own sewing patterns became readily available on the internet. Now, I followed the instructions in this book, Metric Pattern Cutting by Winifred Aldrich, the 3rd edition, and the block did not fit me at all in any shape or form. Now, I tried, of course, retaking my measurements, I tried redrafting the block, and I tried making adjustments to the toile and putting those adjustments back onto the block, and I tried that again and again and again and again, but it was completely beyond me. I could not get a well-fitting block. Now, I realized after a while that there were assumptions built into that method, so I went looking for other methods, other systems, and I tried several, but no luck. I could not get a well-fitting block. I thought that surely there must be a method of drafting the bodice block that would get a better result for women with non-standard figures, that didn't entail first having to draft a block that didn't fit at all, and then having to figure out all the adjustments that needed to be made, and then making those adjustments. I thought at the minimum there must be a method of drafting the block to include the bust cup so that you didn't have to draft a B bust cup and then do the large bust adjustment. So in the end, I created that system myself. Now in this video, my focus is walking you through the assumptions that are built into the Aldrich system. But first I want to make clear that I am not criticizing Aldrich and I am not criticizing her method. Her method and all the other methods I tried were created by pattern makers working in the fashion industry who created these methods to meet the needs of the fashion industry, which is the mass production of clothing. And mass production and custom fit are two different things. They're on the opposite ends of the spectrum. And the fact that this method, the Aldrich method, it's not meant to get a custom fit for everybody. It's obvious from the textbook because there's a section in there that says that if your figure is very different to the standard, then here are all the adjustments that you might need to make. I would think that most people using these textbooks are people who are studying in the fashion industry and want to make standard blocks. So in the fashion industry and in the garment manufacturing industry, they have to use a standard figure, and all of these systems are based on standard figures. Firstly, I want to show you the extent of the problems that I was facing back in 2004, and I'm going to show you two blocks and compare them. And one of them is a custom block that I drafted using my system that fits me really well, and the other one is a block that I drafted using Aldrich's method with my current measurements, and then I'll compare them so you can see the differences in the shape. And then I'm going to walk you through all of the assumptions in the Aldrich method. On the left here is my custom bodice block. This block fits me really well. And with this block, I have drafted the patterns for the dresses and the jacket shown here on the right-hand side. So these dresses fit me really, really well. This block reflects my figure. I use it all the time to draft dresses, tops and jackets. As I said, I drafted this block using my own bodice block drafting method. So on the left is my custom block drafted using my method, and on the right is the block I drafted using Aldrich's instructions with my measurements. Now before I go any further, I want to explain a couple of things to avoid confusion. So I have 2 points that I want to go through. The first is, in Aldrich's instructions, she uses numbers from 0 onwards. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. when plotting the points that make up the block. Because I drafted this block in a pattern making software that does not allow me to use just numbers, I have to use letters as well. So I have put an A before each number. Sometimes, through the rest of this video, when I refer to these numbers, I actually only use the number. So for example, from point 0 to point 1. Other times I do actually use the A as well. So I might say from A14 to A15. So be aware, sometimes I say the A, sometimes I don't. If you refer to Aldrich's book, it would only have the numbers and not the A in front of them. My second point, if you look at the red arrow, it starts from point A0 and finishes at point A2. Now look at the green arrow on the right hand side. It is 0.3 centimeters longer than the red arrow. The horizontal green arrow that starts at point A4 and goes backwards towards A0 does not meet point A0. It is 0.3 centimeters above point 0, and I have called that point X. In Aldrich's instructions, point X is not shown or used because she is drafting a size that does not need this extra 0.3 centimeters. Larger sizes need larger amounts. And when I say size, the instructions tell you to refer to a measurement chart and choose a size based on your bust measurement. Just keep in mind that point X does not appear on Aldrich's graphic, and keep in mind that the distance from A3 to A4 is actually 0.3 centimetres more than A0 to A2. That is important later, and I thought it easier to point this out here, especially given that point X does not appear on Aldrich's instruction graphic. So looking at the block I drafted for myself with my measurements using Aldrich's instructions, there are actually only 9 measurements required in Aldrich's method. Now the block to the hip is commonly referred to as a torso block, whereas the block to the waist is a bodice block. To more easily compare the Aldrich block to my bodice block, I'm going to cut it off at the waistline and do the waist adjustment from Aldrich's book, which extends the waist down for 1 centimetre. I'm also going to manipulate the shoulder dart into the side seam so it's easier to compare the two blocks. So once I've closed the shoulder dart and moved it into the side seam, this is what I end up with. And here is a comparison of the two blocks. The pink is the custom block that fits me. The blue is the Aldrich block that has quite a few fitting issues that need quite a few adjustments. And knowing how to separate each issue to make the necessary adjustments is harder the more issues there are. And for beginners with no sewing or pattern making knowledge, it can be, and it was for me, impossible to work out. Now I'm going to be using my dressmaker's dummy, I call her Dee Dee, to show you the measurements on the body. So when I mention a specific measurement, I'll show it to you both on Dee Dee and on the flat pattern. Dee Dee is wearing a toile, which is a moulage, not a block. The moulage has no ease, unlike the block. So a moulage is better for showing measurements because it is made to the exact body measurements. I'll show you measurements on the 2-dimensional block and on Dee Dee's 3-dimensional body. Assumption number 1 is the full length back measurement. It is not one of the measurements required to draft the block, but it is a measurement used on the block, and it's shown by the orange arrow. The measurements that are listed in blue on the bottom right are the measurements that are required to draft the block, and this measurement is not one of them. This measurement ends up being the nape to waist plus 1.8 centimetres. So let me explain that. The instructions say to measure down from point 0 for 1.5 centimetres and mark point 1. Then from point 1 you measure down for the nape to waist measurement and mark point 5. Now, I said the full length back is 1.8 centimetres more than the centre back, not 1.5 centimetres, because I also have the extra 0.3 centimetres that I mentioned before. For my bust size, it's 0.3 centimetres. If you have a much larger bust size, it will be a different amount according to Aldrich's instructions. Now, on this slide, the full length back may look shorter than the nape to waist on Dee Dee, but if I turn Dee Dee around, you can see that that's not the case. The full length back is longer. So to repeat, the assumption is that the full length back is the nape to waist plus 1.8 centimetres. This does not work for me. My full length back is 2.4 centimetres more than the nape to waist. It also doesn't work for Dee Dee. Given that she is also a size 16 according to Aldrich's measurement table, if she had a block drafted with Aldrich's instructions, she would also end up with a full length back that is 1.8 centimetres more than the nape to waist. That doesn't match her body. She has a 3 centimetre difference between those two measurements. So this assumption does not work for either of us. Before I move on to the next assumption, there's something I want to cover briefly. The bodice that's being drafted is a close-fitting bodice block designed to be used with a fitted sleeve block. So when I talk about the amount of ease that is needed at the upper bust, also known as the underarm level, I am referring specifically to the ease required for a block that will have a fitted sleeve attached. To give you context, a sleeveless block can have less ease. On the other hand, if you're drafting a sleeve with lots of ease, so not a fitted sleeve, lots of ease in either or both the bicep, the sleeve head, you can get away with less ease in the upper bust. But if you have a close fitting bodice block with a fitted sleeve, you do need a certain amount of ease at the upper bust for a full range of movement for the arm. Now this ease is referred to as wearing ease, which is the minimal amount needed for movement. This is different to design ease, which is extra ease above and beyond wearing ease, which is added to the pattern for effect and aesthetic appeal. The next assumption is regarding the upper bust or high bust. This assumption is one I've seen in every method I have tried. You can see on Dee Dee that the measurement I'm talking about is at the underarm level. It's sometimes called the upper bust, sometimes a high bust, or just the underarm level. Now just a quick note, since Dee Dee is wearing a moulage, the line sits exactly at her underarm. On a block though, this line would be placed lower, 2 centimetres or 2.5 centimetres lower, to allow for arm movement. If you have drafted blocks before, you may have noticed something odd. Even though this level is the upper bust or underarm level, the bust measurement is used here. This is odd because the upper bust measurement is actually assumed. It's the definition of a pattern making B cup. it is assumed to be 5 centimetres less than the bust. So the bust measurement plus ease, usually 5 centimetres ease, is applied here at the upper bust, even though the upper bust is assumed to be 5 centimetres smaller than the bust. In most Western systems, patterns are drafted with a pattern-making B bust cup, and the definition of a B bust cup is that there is 5 centimetres difference between the upper bust and full bust. The upper bust is 5 centimetres smaller than the full bust. So, if the upper bust is 5 centimetres smaller than the bust, how can it work out to use the bust measurement, which is larger, plus 5 centimetres ease? Well, in a nutshell, at the upper bust level, you end up with 10 centimetres ease, and that works because that's a good amount of ease for a full range of arm movement with a fitted sleeve attached. So basically, the standard figure ends up with a correct amount of ease using the full bust measurement plus 5 centimetres ease, and the standard figure ends up with 5 centimetre ease at the bust level. But this only works out if the assumption that the upper bust is 5 centimetres smaller than the bust holds true. If that assumption does not hold true, then there will not be the correct amount of ease at the upper bust. So let me repeat that as a summary. There is an assumption that the upper bust is 5 centimetres less than the bust measurement. When this assumption holds true and you use the bust measurement plus 5 centimetres ease at the upper bust, then you will end up with the right amount of ease at the upper bust for the upper bust. If the assumption doesn't hold true, there won't be the right amount of ease at the upper bust. Whether or not you have enough or too much ease will depend on the difference between your upper bust and bust measurements. If your upper bust is, for example, 15 centimetres smaller than your bust measurement, using your full bust measurement here will give you way too much ease. So 20 centimetres ease rather than 10 centimetres ease, which is not good for a fitted block. You may want to see this in action with examples. If you do, check out some of my videos in my Bodice Block Essential playlist. So looking at the information here for my block and Dee Dee's block, you'll see that I have 9 centimetres difference between my upper bust and bust, and Dee Dee has no difference. In my case, as already explained, I will end up with too much ease at the upper bust, and Dee Dee will end up with not enough. Now you may have noticed another issue for Dee Dee, going by the standard definition of the B bust cup, which is that the upper bust is 5 centimetres smaller than the bust. Now this is quite aside from the Aldrich method, I'm just talking about the standard definition. According to that definition, one would assume, just by the measurements, that she has no bust cup at all. She has no bust, but you can see that she does have a bust, and it's actually somewhere between an A cup and a B cup. Now that general definition falls down a bit because of, guess what, an assumption. That assumption relates to using the whole body measurement instead of breaking it down into the two arcs, front and back. That relates to both the upper bust and the bust, and that is coming up next in assumptions 3 and 4. So assumption number 3 is the upper bust arcs. So instead of taking two separate measurements, that is from side seam to side seam for the front and the back, a full circumference measurement is usually used, and somehow in the instructions a side seam placement is determined. There is an assumption being made in what portion of the measurement is allocated to the front and what portion is allocated to the back. If you're wanting the best fit, it's best to take two separate measurements from the body. Now some drafting systems divide the whole measurement in half, other systems allocate a little bit more to the front and a little less to the back. But if the measurement isn't taken from the body, then an assumption is being made. Of course, this is even further complicated by the fact that they are using the bust measurement here at the upper bust. Now, Aldrich does not simply divide the circumference in half, but there is an assumption built in. In her method, the back width and chest width are marked out, and the assumption is that the side seam sits exactly halfway between those 2 points. That is, halfway between point 14 and 15. So if I want to check if that assumption works for me, I can't do so by comparing the two blocks by superimposing them, because the previous assumption has created too much ease at the upper bust for me, so that throws off any meaningful comparison between the two blocks. There is something else muddying the waters there. So I will isolate this assumption on my block. I will check whether my side seam sits halfway between my across back and across chest points. As you can see here, it doesn't. Not for me and not for Dee Dee. The green arrow shows where the halfway point is, and they don't match up with the side seams. As usual, taking the measurements from the body is the best thing to do to get the best custom fit. Assumption number 4 is the bust arcs. This assumption is about how the bust measurement is distributed between the front and the back, from side seam to side seam at the bust level, which is below the upper bust level. So Aldrich's method distributes the bust measurement based partly on the side seam placement, and that's based on an assumption as previously covered. But here's the thing, There are multiple assumptions bundled into this one. The bust arcs is not just about the distribution of the bust measurement, because you need to first establish the placement of the bust level before the distribution can be done correctly. So there are 3 other measurements necessary to establish the placement before the bust arcs can be successfully placed on the block. And those 3 measurements are also assumed. The 3 measurements that are needed to accurately determine where the bust level is the front bust depth, shown here by the green arrow, the bust span, shown by the red arrow, and the bust depth at side seam, as shown by the purple arrow. So in Aldrich's method, all of these measurements are assumed: the bust arcs themselves, the bust depth, the bust span, and the bust depth at side seam. So looking at my block compared to Aldrich's block, firstly, let's just look at the arc distribution. The back measurement is pretty close, but the front is too small by 1.25 centimetres, which would be 2.5 centimetres for the whole front. Now the assumption would be that I would do a large bust adjustment to get that extra 1.25 centimetres that I need. But if I do the large bust adjustment, that is on page 45, and this is the only reference I had at the time, back in 2004 when I was first drafting this block, using that bust adjustment, I do not get a good result, because fixing the problem in one place creates problems elsewhere. So 3 things that were improved by the large bust adjustment: I get the extra 1.25 centimetres in the front bust arc, I get an increase in the centre front length, which I haven't covered yet, but I do need, and I get a larger bust dart, which isn't actually enough, but leaving that aside, I also get more ease in the upper bust. Given I already had too much to start with, this is just making another problem worse. So, going back to the other 3 assumptions about the placement of the bust line, they were also incorrect. Now, one might think that the large bust adjustment would have solved some of these problems, but no. Placing the blocks together so that the centre front lines match, I would still have had to take those measurements from my body to get the right placement of the bust line. So while I'm talking about the arcs, I'll bring in Dee Dee again. Remember I said early on she has no difference between her full circumference bust and her upper bust measurements, which could lead to an assumption that she has no pattern making bust cup. But when the arcs are used, her front upper bust arc is smaller than the front bust arc, so she does have an angle to her side seam. I will point out that this is enlarged without ease at the upper bust, so that angle, that side seam angle, won't be as pronounced on the block. Assumption number 5 is the slope of the shoulders, the shoulder slope front and shoulder slope back. The back shoulder slope is determined by a formula, so you take 1/5 the armhole depth and minus 0.7 of a centimetre. Using that total, you measure down from point 1 and mark point 10. Then you draw a horizontal line out from point 10 at right angles to the centre back line. So the placement of the orange line is what determines the back shoulder slope, and the front shoulder slope is derived from that. You measure down 1.5 centimetres and draw a horizontal line parallel to the back shoulder slope line, as shown by the purple line. So this is one of the worst assumptions for me. It does not work for my body at all. Assumption number 6 is the front armhole depth. There is a back armhole depth that is required for drafting the block, and then the front armhole depth is determined based on the back. It is 1.5 centimetres lower than the back when the blocks are matched up at the armhole side seam. Because of my shoulder slope, my bust cup, and because my dart is in the side seam, it's hard to know how to compare this when superimposing the blocks. But no matter how I place my blocks in relation to each other, there is more than 1.5 centimetres between the front and back armhole depth. Assumption number 7 is the front neck depth and width, which determines the shape of the front neckline. The width and the depth are determined by formulas, so A4 to A20 is the width of the neckline, and there is a formula given 1/5 of the neck measurement minus 0.7 centimetres. And the depth of the front neckline is another formula, 1/5 of the neck measurement minus 0.2 centimetres. My neckline is not as wide, but is lower, so neither of those formulas work for me. I don't get the right neck shape. Assumption number 8 is the centre front length, shown by the red arrow from point A21 to point A6. So that length basically equals x to A5 on the left-hand side, shown by the green arrow, minus A4 to A21, shown by the blue arrow, which is the same thing as saying it's equal to the full length back minus the front neck depth. That doesn't work for me. As I covered earlier though, if I did a large bust adjustment, I would get the extra length I need in the centre front. But as I've also said before, the large bust adjustment doesn't solve all problems and can create new ones or exacerbate existing problems, and you still need to refer to the body measurements to get the details correct. Since it's possible to get most of these things sorted within the block drafting process by using all the measurements that you need for a custom fit, I think it's better to include them from the beginning to avoid having to do so much problem solving afterwards. Assumption number 9 is the dart width. The dart width that is used when drafting this block is based on your bust circumference. You refer to the measurement table on page 15 and you choose the dart based on your bust size. These dart values result in a B bust cut, and so of course doesn't work for me. Again, if I did a large bust adjustment on Aldrich's block, I would get the bigger dart I need, but there would be other problems because of the incorrect upper bust measurement, and I wouldn't actually get a big enough dart without making further adjustments. Assumption number 10 is the hip measurement. In these instructions, the hip measurement isn't asked for and it would be based on the bust measurement, and the assumption is that it's 5 centimeters more than the bust. Now, this doesn't really matter if you are drafting a bodice block that ends at the waist, but the first time I used these instructions, I was following them exactly as written, and that meant drafting the torso block, which extends down to the hip. And the hip measurement was one more thing that ended up completely wrong. And when the hip measurement is too small, it's not just the hip area at the hip depth that ends up too tight. The issue isn't isolated there because the waist shaping is based on the difference between the waist and the hip. And if the hip measurement is wrong, it throws everything off. The darts don't release enough volume below the waist, so the entire lower section ends up too tight. For this reason, I think it's best to draft a bodice block, not a torso block to begin with, because when you isolate issues, rather than trying to solve a number of issues at the same time, it is easier. Assumption number 11 are the side seam points front and back. When shaping the waist, you don't put the entire dart value for the front into the dart below the bust point and the entire dart value for the back in the dart below the shoulder blade. You can distribute some of that value into the side seam, which acts as a dart as well. The general wisdom is that you don't want any really large darts because that can create distortion. So it's best to share the dart value between the dart under the bust point and the side seam. So pattern making textbooks often mention that you shouldn't take out too much in the side seam dart, but usually give standard amounts without explaining what too much means for an individual body. The problem with removing too much from the side seam is that it can create pulling or strain from the bust point to the side seam at the front and from the high neck point to the side seam at the back. In my current block making instructions on YouTube, I haven't yet removed this assumption, but in a future update I'll be including 2 new measurements that allow you to determine the maximum amount that can be removed from the side seam based on your individual body. I'll show you what these measurements are. The front measurement is from the bust point to the side seam waist, and the back measurement is from the high neck point to the side seam back waist. As expected, these do not work out for me at all on the Aldrich block. So here is a summary list of the measurements that are assumed in Aldrich's system. I won't read them out. If these measurements are included in the block making process, it means less adjustments necessary afterwards. The difficulty with making adjustments afterwards isn't just the adjustments, it's working out what the problem is and how to make the necessary adjustment. So this is almost the end of the video. I do have one final note, but before that final note, if you find my content useful, please like and subscribe as this will help grow my channel. And the final note, I will soon be offering a custom block drafting service. I'm still finalising the details, but when I start offering that service, I will put a link in the description box below this video. That link will take you to a page which will have all the details on the price and the process. So if you're interested in having your custom block drafted for you, instead of doing it yourself, then come back in a few weeks' time, so say towards the end of June 2025, to get those details. So thanks and ciao.